Sonoran Desert, Mexico, 1948. A southbound train rushes through the night. On board, a man inside dreams of escape. He pulls himself up to the window of the overcrowded train car and jumps. 5 years ago, he'd boarded a train just like this one, heading north to the United States. That was by invitation, to grow crops for the war effort, and he'd left to cheers and kisses from his parents and siblings. In Texas, he'd found a wife and had children, and a farm owner who didn't care he'd overstayed his visa, at least until a week ago when INS showed up. Now he falls from the deportation train, ordered to take him to a home city he hasn't seen in half a decade, with rumors of beatings and a prison term at the end. He hits the ground hard, rolls. Behind him, he hears shouts. Mexican Border Patrol open fire from the train. A bullet slaps by, then another. He limps into the desert, realizing they aren't trying that hard to hit him. The train then carries on, disappearing into the blue dark, and he is alone in the desert night, with a sprained ankle and a long walk back north. This historical tale that mirrors today's headlines is brought to you by Ground News, my personal go-to for navigating today's chaotic media landscape. Last episode, we discussed how, in the 1930s, the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service began a decade-long campaign of raids heavily focused on the city of Los Angeles. Why? Well, gestures broadly, but also because it had the largest Mexican immigrant community in the nation. But we should explain why there was such a large presence of Mexican immigrants, both officially and unofficially, in Southern California and, to a lesser extent, Texas. First, it's important to understand that some of these families predated U.S. control over the Southwest. After all, the Spanish began settling Texas in the 1690s and California in 1769. When the U.S. took them after the Texas Revolution and Mexican War, the existing Mexican communities stayed. Meaning, for some of these families, they didn't cross the border crossed them. For others south of the border, circular trips north for work, trade, or family was an established pattern that continued after political division. Indeed, most migrants that came to the United States from Mexico, again both officially and unofficially, did not intend to stay and settle. Most worked low-wage agricultural jobs, then returned to Mexico where the US dollar they'd earned could buy them and their families a better life. For a long time, this wasn't really a problem. Outside of military conflicts, land borders in the 19th century were extremely loose worldwide. There was more focus on controlling entry through ports. It wasn't until World War I raised the specter of espionage and sabotage that things like border checkpoints, visas, and extensive documentation for citizens and non-citizens really became a thing. While there is a long history of travel papers, Germany became the first country to require a photo with passports in 1915, and it was only in 1917 that the US followed suit. Even then, it was novel and not standard. And while today you can't even smile in a passport photo, in the 1920s, people had photos of them reading books, playing instruments, and even with other family members and pets. Now, did I need to tell you that? I mean, do you really need to know that this guy reading is a real passport photo, or this lady with her dog, or even this shared one between 30 Polish students? Technically, no. But given how heavy this topic is, also yes. Because looking at old passport photos does remind us that behind every piece of documentation is a person, and that as we talk about big numbers here, that every number is a person and a story and a life. To get back on topic, though, these deportation enforcement programs in the 1930s were basically enforcing a new standard of dealing with the border. A situation that was not considered a crisis until the Great Depression, when both politicians and organized labor started considering migration a threat to jobs and wages. Indeed, there was a reason INS was part of the Labor Department. This was considered an economic problem. And while they argued that these raids were only targeted at foreign nationals who'd crossed the border illegally, in reality, they swept up a number of citizens or legal migrants who were not given a chance to plead their case. Similarly, they scared a number of mixed-status families into fleeing. Yet in 1941, the calculus changed. Suddenly, with the U.S. entry into World War II, the draft, and most young men from farming communities volunteering for national service, the worry about the availability of labor reversed. Suddenly, American crops were rotting because there were not enough workers to pick them. At a time when U.S. agricultural production was a major component of supporting the war effort and often supplying food to allies, that was unacceptable. As a result, in 1942, the U.S. approached Mexico to form the Bracero Accords, named after the Spanish word for manual labor, literally meaning one who works with his arms. The Bracero Program was intended to fill the labor gap by providing seasonal temporary work visas to Mexican agricultural laborers. These men, they were exclusively men, would travel to the U.S. under government supervision and literally be delivered to farms who had registered as needing labor. Mexico, in contrast, got a pipeline for feeding its economy more powerful U.S. dollars. But it was a bit more than that. See, Mexico was also a major player in this circulation of migrants from Mexico to the U.S. and back. While the infusion of US dollar remittances to their economy was nice, the Mexican government had been trying for decades to stop the large number of Mexican men going to the US seeking work. In fact, while the Mexican Constitution of 1917 said it was a citizen's right to freely enter and exit the country, those working abroad were supposed to have a labor contract signed by foreign authorities and approved by the foreign consulate before exiting Mexico. But because U.S. law forbid offering a contract to foreign workers before they arrived, crossing the border north to work was not legally possible on either side of the border. So through the 1920s, you had a demand for labor in the American Southwest and no legal way to fulfill it with cross-border workers. Meanwhile, landowners in Mexico were complaining to the government that all their agricultural laborers were still heading north. Indeed, Mexico had supported the crackdowns of the 1930s as a way to return laborers and frequently ran public information campaigns warning of racial discrimination and labor abuses which happened to those crossing the border to work. Yet the flow was unstoppable. So the Bracero Program was seen as a way to legitimize and control the already existing circulation of labor. And honestly, the Bracero Program was a success by most American measures. Between 1942 and 1945, 168,000 braceros came to work in the U.S. In fact, it was so successful that the U.S. continued the program after the war ended, since that agricultural labor shortage only got more dire. Victory in the Second World War spurred an economic boom due to a rise in American manufacturing, troops returning with money to spend, and the fact that the U.S. was one of the only great powers not bombed into oblivion. Basically, the U.S. had grown manufacturing and economic capacity while pretty much everyone else had it diminished. Similarly, due to the GI Bill and a large number of demobilized troops now having received job training that might have been otherwise unavailable, a lot of farmhands never returned to the fields. Think about it. If you're a farm kid who the military has taught to work construction machinery or fix radios or maintain aircraft engines, chances are you may want to go do that instead. So as a result, the Bracero Program was extended on an annual basis after the war. Though Mexico was, let's say, less happy with the results. See, as soon as the program was announced, tens of thousands of applicants thronged government offices, far more than expected. And because the program only took those with agricultural experience, who were not landowners and in good health, a lot of interested applicants did not qualify. But given that the whole idea was to support defense production, and even the Bracero Program could not supply all the labor needed, during the war, it became normal for U.S. authorities to look the other way. In fact, when agribusiness owners said they were worried participating in the program would expose them to risks should some of the workers they hired end up, just accidentally, mind you, being undocumented, INS was pretty clear. The government, quietly but explicitly, told farm owners they wouldn't be punished if they hired off-the-book workers. Meaning that the Bracero Program didn't actually cap the outflow of undocumented labor from Mexico to the United States. Business owners in Mexico protested that their government was allowing a labor drain, when those workers should be staying in Mexico to develop the country's own economy and infrastructure. At the same time, workers allowed into the U.S. via the Bracero Program complained about how they ended up working with undocumented migrants anyway, who undercut wages and lowered overall working conditions. Plus, to a certain extent, the whole situation was embarrassing for the Mexican government. This was emblematic of how the promise of the Mexican Revolution remained unfulfilled, and that poverty and lack of capital in Mexico meant its citizens were being tempted across the border. So in 1944, it began pressuring U.S. Border Patrol to tighten enforcement and work with Mexican Border Patrol to increase apprehensions at the southern border. And that request fit with the INS having changed its mission to more of a policing role. In fact, it had become a part of the Department of Justice in 1940. The result was a doubling of apprehensions, from 11,775 in 1943 to 28,173 in 1944. But this rise in interdictions also brought to light another problem. U.S. Border Patrol could not operate in Mexico, so the best they could do was deport the apprehended migrants across the border, at which point they would just try to re-enter. To prevent this, in 1945, the U.S. and Mexican Border Patrol changed tactics and began collaborating to shuttle apprehended migrants to the Mexican interior. It worked like this. Roving bands of U.S. Border Patrol operating as far away as Chicago would lead raids on farms and businesses that detained undocumented migrants, also at times citizens who did not have their paperwork on hand, and transported them to Nogales, Arizona, if they were from the western part of Mexico, or El Paso if they hailed from the eastern part. Only people who were residents of the border area were returned there, but those from further south would board a bus that U.S. Border Patrol would drive to the border, get out, and be replaced by Mexican Border Patrol. From there, the Mexican Border Patrol would load them onto trains bound for cities such as Monterrey and Torreon. A similar effort started using cargo ships bringing agricultural products to the U.S. and then returning with deportees crammed into holds. Yet Mexico considered it still not enough. In 1947, Mexico made it a crime to leave Mexico without proper authorization, punishable by up to a 10,000 peso fine and 2 to 5 years in jail. In 1949, Mexico stepped up enforcement again. It declared a national emergency to put 5,000 military troops on the border in order to increase apprehensions. The men caught were then not returned to their homes, but frequently coerced into accepting farm work in the area in a process that amounted to a forced labor campaign. In 1951, the U.S. added deportation flights to the Mexican interior, contracted through private carriers. Yet, despite this gradual step up in enforcement, throughout the 1940s, the border just wasn't on most Americans' radar. In fact, the biggest pushback was in Texas, where the Bracero Program was less popular because, get this, government-mandated levels for wages and work conditions were considered too generous. Many farm owners in the state complained that the government was practically forcing them to hire laborers who'd entered illegally. But that changed with the advent of the Cold War. As the global face-off between the Soviet Union and the United States intensified, a new threat narrative came to the fore that began speaking of immigrants as a political threat rather than an economic one. Now Latino immigrants were not a risk to labor, but to national security. Stories circulated in newspapers, claiming cells of communists were forming in Mexico City, attempting to sneak into the United States and foment revolution, particularly by infiltrating labor. This was, in some ways, a bit of a joke. Mexico's conservative institutional revolutionary party had a lock on political power and even founded new security agencies to cooperate with the CIA. Yet in Congress, cries grew in 1952 that the border was a national security time bomb, with the possibility of infiltration and subversion. Remember that this was the height of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, as well as the Korean War, where anti-communist propaganda rocked the government. Meanwhile, the economy was starting to soften, as troops demobilized from the Korean War came home to find the job market tightening and wage competition once again causing friction. Labor unions once more rang the alarm bells of migrants taking jobs and depressing wages. And in the closing days of the Truman administration, a report on the border situation tied all of these factors together. That a, quote, invasion of Mexican migrants had undercut the economy and could be bringing subversive ideas into the country. But acting on it would be the job of the next president, a man who had no civilian experience in government, but had stepped into the presidential race in order to defend NATO from a primary challenger who threatened to pull out of it. Dwight D. Eisenhower, a military man who, perhaps inevitably, decided to implement a military solution to the border headed by the soldiers that he served with. And it would be known by the atrocious name Operation Wetback. And even though today deportation campaigns aren't as blatantly racist in their naming conventions, that doesn't seem to be slowing down the current crackdown on foreign workers themselves. For instance, I just saw on Ground News that the Trump administration is reviewing all 55 million people with US visas for potential deportable violations. Yikes, that is a lot of work. I really hope, that DOJ left some people in the State Department to handle all that. Ground News not only collects and organizes thousands of news articles like this for you every day, but also shows you exactly how news stories are being covered across the political spectrum via their super handy visual breakdown of every story's political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. That is why I am one of the 1 million people that have downloaded the Ground News app. Heading back to that visa story, which I'm sure will have no negative effects on the US economy, Ground News made it easy for me to compare headlines and see how organizations' bias affect framing. One right-leaning headline said, Trump's deputies promise, quote, continuous vetting of 55 million US visa holders worldwide, while on the left a headline reads, quote, US continues visa vetting even after admission, officials say. Because, who needs certainty when picking where you study, work, and live, am I right? So, if you'd like tools to help you stay on top of the news and sift through all of the daily misinformation and bias, we can get you 40% off the Ground News Vantage subscription by going to ground.news/extra, clicking the link in the description below, or scanning that QR code right over here to get unlimited access to all of their features. That discount, by the way, brings the price of the Vantage plan down to like $40 a year, which is less than a cup of coffee a month, for just way smarter news. Again, for the most effective news feed possible, click or scan here, and then once you are in the know, check out our next video here. Huzzah, friends! Ziliad's Architectures, Lotus Wolf, Joseph Blame, Hunter Z, Dominic Valenciana, Arles Posting, and Angelo Valenciana are truly the best among us as legendary patrons.